comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Good afternoon and welcome to GB News. You are watching Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson, on your TV, radio and online. This show is all about championing common sense. It's a space for discussion, debate and reason. But before we get started, Polly Middlehurst has your latest headlines.
Calvin, thank you. And our top story on GB News this afternoon at just after 2 o'clock. A community in Ireland is in shock and trying to process the grief as 10 people who were killed in a service station explosion in County Donegal on Friday have been named by police. They are Leona Harper, James O'Flaherty, Martin McGill, Robert Gower and his daughter Shauna, Jessica Gallagher, Martina Martin, Catherine O'Donnell and her son James, and Hughie Kelly, all among those who lost their lives in the small community of Creesla in County Donegal. The Taoiseach, Michael Martin, has visited the site of the explosion and says the entire nation is in mourning following the tragedy. The Irish authorities say the explosion is still being treated as a tragic accident, although investigations are ongoing. Well, in news away from Ireland, 3 cabinet ministers who all stood against Liz Truss in the Conservative leadership contest are urging their colleagues to unite and support the Prime Minister. Penny Mordaunt, Suella Braverman and Nadeem Zahawi are all calling for the party to unite around its new leader or risk ending up in opposition. The Environment Secretary, Ranil Jayawardena, has also written a newspaper article this morning telling the party it is time to rally round. International news, and Russia is busy assessing the damage on its only bridge to occupied Crimea after a huge blast destroyed large areas of it yesterday. President Vladimir Putin has ordered the country's Federal Security Service, that's the FSB, to now guard the key connector to the occupied peninsula of Crimea. Traffic flow, we understand, has resumed along part of the route, and the Kremlin is ordering repair work begins immediately. Ukraine has previously said the crossing is a military target, but they haven't claimed direct responsibility for the attack. At least 13 people have been killed and around 49, including 6 children, in hospital after the shelling in the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia. Residential buildings were damaged in 12 Russian missile strikes, according to the governor of the region. The authorities say a rescue operation is still underway. Here, barristers are voting on whether to end strike action after receiving a pay offer from the government. The offer includes reforms to set fees for legal aid work and an investment of £54 million in the criminal bar. That's according to the Ministry of Justice. The vote closes at midnight tonight. 185 people, including 19 children, are said to have died in protests across Iran over the last 3 weeks. Demonstrations began in mid-September after the funeral of Mahsa Amini, who died after she was detained by the so-called morality police over allegations she had been wearing her hijab too loosely. According to the human rights group in Iran, hundreds of women and girls from high schools and universities across the country have been taking part in protests, despite allegations of brutal treatment towards them and accusations that the authorities are using tear gas and live ammunition to disperse the protests. Here, Buckingham Palace has released a new picture of one of the Queen's favourite ponies. If you're watching on television, you'll be able to see Emma, the fell pony, who was part of the procession at the Queen's state funeral. And you may remember stood next to the long walk to Windsor Castle as Her Majesty's coffin was being driven past. The palace says Emma will continue to be looked after and much loved, as the Queen would have wished, as she's cared for in Windsor. That's your latest news. More news as it happens. Now let's get back to Calvin.
Hello and welcome. This is my brand new show, The Common Sense Crusade, with me, Calvin Robinson. You guys, the viewers at home and the listeners, you asked for this, so thank you, because here it is. Here's what's coming up this afternoon. The Church of England has found hundreds of new cases involving allegations of abuse of vulnerable adults and children by clergy, church officers and volunteers. It is the most extensive review of past abuse cases. The Archbishops of Canterbury and York have both apologised and expressed profound shame at the findings. We'll be discussing the findings of the report and what needs to change. And J.K. Rowling has challenged TV presenter and trans activist India Willoughby to sue her in a Twitter row. The author criticised celebrities who have backed the controversial trans charity Mermaids and claimed they have an unprecedented influence in the UK. Also, I was walking through Trafalgar Square on Friday and encountered Just Stop Oil protesters gluing themselves to the roads to block off the landmark. More than 30 of them were arrested. I'll be joined by one of their spokesmen after 3 p.m. to ask them the simple question, to what end? And of course, you can join in any of our discussions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet at gbnews. Deus Volt. On my Common Sense Crusade, we won't shy away from any difficult topics, any of those areas that the mainstream media tends to shy away from or deflect from. However, I did not intend for my first show to be focused on the crimes of the established church. The Church of England and I have a torrid past, but it would be remiss of me not to raise this subject. In fact, I have been one of the most vocal challengers of abuse in terms of Pakistani Muslim rape gangs, following in the footsteps of the brilliant Maggie Oliver, raising the important conversation that many others would sweep under the carpet for the sake of diversity. But the abuse of children is the greatest evil there is. And I would be a hypocrite if I talked about the abuse perpetrated by the so-called religion of peace if I didn't also address the problem on our own doorstep. The Church of England released a report this week highlighting the fact that it has discovered hundreds of new cases of abuse of children and vulnerable adults by clergy, church officers and volunteers. The review found 383 cases relating to abuse that the Church says require further attention. 168 relate to children and 149 to vulnerable adults. There were outcries from some abuse survivors who say they feel betrayed because they say that after they weren't included in the report, they were left out because their cases were not the cause of concern category marked by the report. This is a great shame, and a reason the Church conducted this review is because what they're calling PCR2 or Past Cases Review 2 is because the last review, PCR1, conducted back in 2008 and 2009, was found to be insufficient. Files were found to have gone missing, protocols were not followed consistently, if at all, and there were serious shortcomings in the implementation of the report in 7 dioceses. These are the Church's own admissions. The report shares anger, frustration and criticism of many survivors and victims over the experiences that they endured. In an institution obsessed with safeguarding, how does this continue to happen? Perhaps the overemphasis on bureaucracy, filling in the right forms, has taken over the human element of looking out for people. The Church is due a reminder that the people within it have a care of duty over all of God's people. A priest's main obligation is to care for the cure of souls within his parish, to pray for them, to support them pastorally, and to offer spiritual direction. There are so many truly wonderful clergymen up and down the country providing sustenance for the soul through the most blessed sacrament. However, there's a wicked minority of evil infiltrators who are letting the side down. If just one person is put off from attending church due to this scandal, that is one too many. Our job is to bring people closer to Christ, not to drive them away. Shame, I say. The established church, much like the church in Rome, needs to clean up its act. I say that out of love. I love the church. Ultimately, it is a force for good. But like all institutions, it is made up of individuals. And as individuals, we are fallen. We are all fallen. The church as a body needs to work better. It needs to work harder on rooting out the rot. And that starts with discipline. Discipline of culture, discipline of theology, and discipline of liturgy. Safeguarding isn't a box-ticking exercise. It's a way of life. And if we live lives in Christ, safeguarding is a natural byproduct. The church owes it to all the people it has done harm to over the years to do better. The church was quick to implement recommendations from their racially charged Lament to Action report. It must do the same with PCR2. For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. Each hour of the Common Sense Crusade, we're going to stick it to a theme, and this theme is safeguarding. Until 3 p.m, we'll be talking about safeguarding our children. And there was only one story for me to start with that really stuck home on this, and that's the Church of England's revealing report of 400 or just under 400 new abuse allegations. In response to the review, the church's lead bishop for safeguarding, Jonathan Gibbs, said, "I want to add my voice to the Archbishop's apology for all who have been affected by what we have not done well enough or failed to do. Safeguarding is everyone's responsibility, and like all institutions, we must continue our development at every level to ensure this is part of our DNA, not an add-on, and to see this as a fundamental part of our Christian witness. Working with survivors and victims is a key part of our ongoing safeguarding work, and one of the national recommendations particularly highlighted by the reviewers is for a survivor and victims charter to ensure the voices of children are fully heard and understood. The second version of the past cases review is highly critical of a culture within the church of still not adequately dealing with abuse. So what needs to be done moving forward? Joining me now is Andrew Greystone. He is the author of Bleeding for Jesus, and he is an advocate for survivors of abuse. First of all, thank you very much for joining me today, Andrew, on this very serious topic. What did you make of the results of the findings of this report of PCR2?
It's utterly horrific, Calvin. It's completely horrific in two different ways. The first is the sheer scale of the problem, and the second is the complacency of the church nationally in its response. The scale, as you said, is completely astounding. 383 new cases of abuse. That's cases that were known about because they were documented within the church's personnel files, but haven't been adequately dealt with. And they go on top of all the existing cases that were known about. Those are 383 people, at the very least, whose lives have been devastated by their contact with the church. Not blessed, not improved, but devastated. If you imagine can you imagine an airline that was running a service and they knew on their records that a particular aeroplane had crashed or had near misses 383 times? You would immediately say that airline should not be allowed to fly. Or a pharmaceutical company that had a drug product that had caused damage in 383 different cases. You would say that company must not be allowed a license to produce drugs.
You would think so, Andrew, but the last couple of years has shown us that that's not always the case. What I want to get to, and we will get to government intervention though, is that the church, I'm not a member of the Church of England anymore, but I have just spent the last couple of years training within the Church of England, and it is obsessed with safeguarding. Everywhere you turn, you're hearing conversations about safeguarding, new forms to fill out, new hoops to jump through. In an environment that is obsessed with safeguarding, how are they failing to safeguard so regularly?
The report itself talks about the culture that is causing these failures. It's a culture of undue deference to senior clergy. The bishop must know best. And in the Church of England, it's the bishop in each diocese who has personal responsibility for overseeing safeguarding. There's too much deference to those figures. There's a culture of protectionism towards clergy, that if somebody makes an allegation against a member of the clergy, the likelihood is that the clergy person is the one who's going to be believed and the victim is the one who is going to be blamed. It's not me saying this. This is what comes out in the report itself. There's a culture of disbelief and inertia that's mentioned in this report. So however many layers of boxes to tick or training courses to go on, if that culture remains in the church, this is going to continue to be a problem.
I think we've all identified that cultural problem, but the issue is, how do you change a culture? And I know you've tweeted this week about government intervention. Do you think that could have a greater impact on shifting the culture of the church?
I think that the whole business of safeguarding within the Church of England needs to be done by an independent organisation. Either an organisation that's set up specially or experts from outside who are called in to run the Church of England's safeguarding for it and to make it safe. And where I think government intervention is needed is that at the moment the Church of England is resistant to having anyone in to do its safeguarding for it. And the only way I can see that happening is if the government forces it to happen. I'm not saying that the government is the agency that ought to be in charge of safeguarding, but it's only the government, I think, that can take it out of the hands of the bishops, who have failed consistently now over decades. It's no good the archbishops saying that they feel great shame if shame doesn't lead to change. And the response this week to the report has been so complacent. The church has been saying, well, if we all keep doing what we're doing, but we try a little bit harder, we do a little bit better, we add some more courses or a little bit more money, then it'll all be fine. And the reality is, no, it won't. And that's been proven time and time again. The church, it breaks my heart to say it, but the church can no longer be trusted to manage its own safeguarding processes.
I think you make an absolutely brilliant point there, so thank you for that. That was Andrew Greystone, author of Bleeding for Jesus and an advocate for survivors of abuse. Thank you for your time today. Now, to continue this discussion, I'm joined by Marilyn Hawes. She is the director and CEO of the community interest company Freedom from Abuse. She's a former teacher whose 3 children were allegedly sexually abused by her then colleague, Geoffrey Carney. In 2014, Mr. Carney was jailed for indecently assaulting 2 boys, not Marilyn's, and he died 4 years ago. Marilyn, welcome to the show. Such a dark introduction, and I apologise for having to clarify that.
No. I mean, this is why Freedom from Abuse exists, because when that happened to me, I was so shocked because he used to sit behind me in the pew behind me, and I wrote a book called Never Take No for an Answer. And the first time I met him was a tap on the shoulder when I was pregnant with my daughter, my little 2-year-old boy, who's now 41, and saying, what a lovely little boy. Where will he go to school? I'm the new head teacher. And so then, you know, then it went from there, this very lovely friendship. You see, since all this happened, and I found he was actually a paedophile. I worked at the school with him. I was 10 years there at the school, 17 years as his friend. When the police came to tell me that he was being looked at for paedophilic behaviour.
So let's move it on from him in particular to how did this impact your family, Marilyn?
Oh, my word, it was like a tsunami. I mean, I was physically sick when the police came. I didn't know what grooming was. I'd been on the safeguarding courses. It was all about, you know, the funny man in the park. I didn't realise how grooming actually worked and how slow it can take. And that, referencing Andrew, is what is missing in all establishments. I totally agree. The church has proven yet again it cannot cope with its safeguarding. And this is because they don't want to think of the unthinkable. The people in the pews don't want to think the unthinkable. They don't want to think about the nasty stuff. Well, in nearly every congregation, there will be people who have been sexually abused. Just because they haven't told you, just, you know, you don't know, but they will be there. And
you were telling me a statistic before we went on about mental health.
Well, the mental health. I mean, this is the mental health. About 80% of mental health issues in this country go back to childhood sexual abuse and interference, and it's a massive problem. And until the church, many years ago, 10 years ago, I went to York Minster to train the senior safeguarding leads of every diocese. I have never met a more toxic, arrogant bunch of people. Most of them had been former social workers, and I said to them, and I say it in schools, I say it everywhere, until you can identify the behaviour of a groomer in plain sight, it doesn't matter how many forms you've got, it doesn't matter how many procedures and policies you've got, you're going to miss it. Because they operate in plain sight, schmoozing like the Pied Piper.
This is the problem, isn't it? It's such a huge scale. We can't verify that 80% number, but that's a very dramatic number. And if that's the case, the problem is It's impossible to identify a groomer because that's what a groomer does.
It's not.
They infiltrate
It's not impossible. It's not impossible. If you train it, that's what we do.
Right.
Because when I discovered what had happened, the first thing I wanted to know was, are people born to abuse? No, they're not. Something happens in those early years that disturbed the trauma, not necessarily sexual abuse itself. It's only 1 in 8. The Institute of Health say 1 in 8 was sexually abused. The other 7 out of 8, it's a brokenness in those early lives. We need to be better parents. And those behaviours that were overly sexualised can be seen through the infant school, the primary school. They're not looked at properly. They're not understood properly by even social services or the police. And so it goes on. And until we get into the early years, until I actually, because I spent 17 years watching a paedophile at play, I act it out. And I do it with a teddy bear, and you are left in no doubt to recognise it again. We have seen people with our training, people have come up and said, oh my gosh, I know one.
Right.
And we have seen so many people go into the courts because they've had this training. That's what the church doesn't want to have to do. I've offered it in my own church.
So why don't we build that into the recruitment
process?
Well,
why don't we? Exactly. Why isn't it mandatory? Why don't we have mandatory training? And we absolutely need mandatory reporting, because to mandatorily report, you need to understand grooming. Because if you miss it and then someone says, well, you should have reported it, it has to be bolted into that, definitely. But what is also shocking, and the government make the laws, right? The government make the laws. So how is it still law that in 2022, any member of the clergy who knows a child has been raped does not have to report it? Now, the trouble with the ICSA inquiry is it has no teeth. It can recommend, but it can't enforce. So about a year or so ago, I spoke to people at ICSA, and it was all about statutory guidance. Right. Statutory guidance is not law. So I might say to you, well, if you see anything, Kelvin, we really do want you to report it. But if you don't, nothing's going to happen. Yeah, we saw the difference between statutory guidance and law over the last couple of years over COVID, didn't we? Exactly. It's not law. It needs to be law. Would you be along the same line as Andrew, thinking that we need to take this independent and safeguarding needs to be taken away from the church? Completely. And, I saw it for myself at York Minster. I was appalled. I actually wrote a press release about it because the attitude of arrogance, complacency, there were people on their mobile phones. It was absolutely shocking. And if you failed and they failed again, then, and it's proved with 400 more cases, they don't understand grooming. Yeah. And the fact that 25% of convicted paedophiles who then come out, 25% of those attend a church. Now, it might be because they're looking for redemption. When they come out of prison. When they come out of prison, yeah. And when you go into prisons and you talk to the officers, the prison officers, you talk to the chaplain, and they say, oh, you always know when the parole board is due because everybody wants a Bible. Right. Everybody wants to go to the chapel. These are absolutely A-class liars. Okay. They are in denial about what they do. And that's the fear that if they go into a church, what's it full of? When you put adults with children and vulnerable adults. So I was a vulnerable adult. I had a dodgy marriage. The guy who sat behind me smelt it. They actually say to me in prison, we smell vulnerability like French perfume. And if it's that easy to spot, more needs to be done to be spotted. Exactly. And it is not difficult to spot it. But, we've been around 19 years and it's still like trying to pull teeth. Please listen to Marilyn. Marilyn Hawes there, Director and CEO of Freedom from Abuse. Now, before we move on, here is what the Archbishops of Canterbury and York said in response to the second version of the past cases review. We sincerely apologise for our failures and want to reach out to those who are still suffering from the pain and misery they endured. It was not your fault and you are not to blame. We should have been better at listening and responding to survivors' and victims' concerns. Our faith compels us to take safeguarding with the utmost seriousness to prevent abuse from occurring, responding appropriately where it has, in support of our undertaking to making church communities and institutions safer places. Plenty more to come on this afternoon. Next, we'll be talking to a lawyer who has represented some of the people who have been a victim of the abuse and get his thoughts on how we can stop child abuse in a religious setting. But first, let's take a look at the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry towards the southeast, but wind and rain spreading in from the northwest. Let's home in on that detail. So starting off in the southwest then, and here a mostly fine end to the day, but it will turn cloudier and windier ahead of some rain arriving overnight. Also a fine picture in the southeast, late sunshine, then clear skies after dusk, rain arriving there by the end of the evening. Wind and rain already reaching northern and western parts of Wales by 7 o'clock this evening, but drier towards the southeast, particularly around the Swansea area. It'll also be a largely dry start to the evening across the Midlands. That rain pushing in overnight, meaning everyone will have some wet and windy weather for a time. And a similar picture across the northeast of England, where the rain will be starting to push in, but won't affect most people until overnight. The winds strengthening and clouds building ahead of it. Meanwhile, taking a look at Scotland, the rain will have already cleared northern and western parts, with clear, colder air feeding in, a wet and windy end to the day in the south and east. And the heavy rain also largely clearing Northern Ireland, where it will then be mostly dry through the night, under clear skies turning quite chilly as well. Looking at the national picture overnight, you can see how the rain will progress southeastwards, with a few showers following on, and that's how the weather's shaping up for this evening.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie's. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness, brilliant.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back. Now, Marilyn Hawes claimed that 25% of paedophiles released from a prison attend a church. We cannot verify that, and we have to state that. Now, on 20th of October, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sex Abuse, ICSA, will publish its final report. This report was established 8 years ago and has investigated a range of institutions in England and Wales, both religious and secular. So will its findings help prevent more cases of abuse, like the hundreds of alleged cases we've seen in the Church of England this week? Joining me now to discuss this is Richard Scorer, Head of Abuse Law and Public Inquiries at Solicitors Slater and Gordon. First of all, Richard, thank you for joining us. Incredible numbers that we're talking about here, and the insight from this report is shocking. On the allegations in the Church of England, what are your takes of PCR2?
Well, I agree with what Andrew Greystone said a moment ago. I mean, this shows that the Church of England has a massive problem, and I think there is a degree of complacency in dealing with it. I wanted actually to pick up on your point about bureaucracy in the Church of England, because We looked in ICSA at some of the paperwork in the Church of England to do with safeguarding. It is extraordinarily convoluted and difficult to follow. When you read it, it's very difficult to work out who is supposed to do what and when. So there is a massive issue actually about that. It needs to be massively simplified, quite apart from anything else. So that's one issue. But going beyond that, I think that we've got to a point now where we can't trust the Church of England and indeed other institutions to deal with these sorts of issues effectively in-house. And we do need new legislation, new laws to address that.
Absolutely. And what new legislation are we looking at, such as mandatory reporting?
I think mandatory reporting is fundamental to this. I mean, people don't always appreciate that we still have a situation in this country in 2022 where a teacher or a member of the clergy, for example, can know that a child has been raped and not tell anybody about it, not report that so that it can be investigated. And that needs to change. I mean, most Western countries have some form of mandatory reporting. We are very unusual, actually, in England and Wales in not having that. We need to change that. I hope that that's one of the recommendations that will come out of ICSA. Obviously, we'll have to see.
And do you think there's a chance that we could see safeguarding removed from the Church of England entirely and a separate body or institution set up to run that?
Well, I think the Church of England has to own safeguarding. I mean, if you have a church event, the church has to take seriously the safeguarding of children at that event, whatever it happens to be. So they have to own it in that sense. What we do need is proper external oversight of how that safeguarding is being done. And I think we also need better or properly independent mechanisms for handling complaints. I think there is a perception in the Church of England that safeguarding can be weaponised. Actually, this is a perception that's shared both by survivors of abuse and those who are concerned about false allegations. And there is a perception that if you know the right people in the Church of England, your case will be dealt with more leniently, for example, than somebody else's. So there is, I think, a lack of confidence in the ability of the Church of England to investigate complaints fairly and impartially, and that needs to be addressed.
So on that, how hard is it to take the church to court over abuse allegations?
Well, of course, I and other lawyers have brought many cases against the Church of England over the years. There are various legal defences that they use. In fairness, the Church of England is better than some organisations in that they haven't been. They haven't used the time limit defence as much as many organisations have done. So that's a positive. And one of the things I'm arguing for is that the time limit laws are reformed. In terms of, I think, the sort of civil compensation aspect, there are changes there that need to happen, but those apply across the board to many organisations, not simply the Church of England.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. That was Richard Scorer, who's the head of abuse law and public inquiries at solicitors Slater and Gordon. I do find it interesting that this report was released on the day of Liz Truss's first major speech. Coincidence? Who knows? Here's what the Archbishop of Canterbury and York had to say in response to the second version of the past cases review. Our aspiration is for a church where children, young people and the vulnerable can worship, learn, socialise and develop in a safe and caring environment, with the knowledge they have a voice and can confidently raise concerns. We sincerely apologise for our failures and want to reach out to those who are still suffering from the pain and misery they endured. You're with GB News on TV, online and on radio, and next we'll be discussing the author J.K. Rowling challenging trans charity Mermaids to sue her in a Twitter spat. Now it's time for a check of the news headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
Calvin, thank you. The latest headlines this hour. 10 people who were killed in a service station explosion in County Donegal in Ireland on Friday have been named by police today. They've been named as Leona Harper, James O'Flaherty, Martin McGill, Robert Garwett and his daughter Shauna, Jessica Gallagher, Martina Martin, Catherine O'Donnell and her son James, and Hughie Kelly, all among those who lost their lives in the small community of Creesler in County Donegal. Well, the Irish authorities are saying the explosion is being treated still as a tragic accident, although investigations are ongoing. A community in shock in Ireland today. In other news, Russia is assessing the damage on its only bridge to occupied Crimea after a huge blast destroyed large areas of it yesterday. President Putin has ordered the country's Federal Security Service to guide the bridge now, and Ukraine previously saying the crossing was a target, but they haven't claimed responsibility for the attack. 185 people, including 19 children, are said to have died in protests across Iran over the last 3 weeks. Demonstrations began in mid-September after the funeral of Mahsa Amini, who died after she was detained by the so-called morality police over allegations she was wearing her hijab too loosely. According to the Iran Human Rights Group, hundreds of women and girls from high schools and universities have taken part in protests across the country, despite allegations of brutal treatment towards them and accusations the authorities are using tear gas and live ammunition to disperse them. And lastly, Buckingham Palace has released a new image of one of the Queen's favourite ponies, Emma, the fell pony, who was part of the procession at the Queen's state funeral, standing next to the Long Walk in Windsor as the Queen's coffin was driven past. The palace is saying Emma will continue to be much loved, as the Queen would have wanted, and cared for in Windsor. You're up to date on TV, online and on DAB+ radio. You're with GB News. Calvin will be back in just a tick.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back to Common Sense Crusade. I'm Calvin Robinson. Now, J.K. Rowling has challenged TV presenter and trans activist India Willoughby to sue her in a Twitter row after the author criticised celebrities who had backed the controversial trans charity Mermaids. J.K. Rowling says that the charity had achieved an unprecedented influence in the UK with the help of certain celebrities who boosted them despite red flags. I tend to agree. To continue the theme of safeguarding this hour, I'm asking the question whether or not our children need charities like Mermaids that supposedly support them with transgender issues. Joining me now is Peter Tatchell, LGBTQ activist and director of the Peter Tatchell Foundation, and Simon Calvert, deputy director of the Christian Institute. Peter, is JK not correct in saying that they have unprecedented influence in the UK?
I wouldn't say unprecedented. They are a charity like many others, and of course they seek to advance their interest in the work they do. And for the most part, the parents of trans children and trans children themselves say that Mermaids does a great job and has helped them and has actually given them great comfort and support, enable those trans children to lead happier, more fulfilled lives. So I think all these allegations and threats of legal action, I think, are just a bit over the top.
I've got to pull you up on that point already, because we can't on my show talk about trans children as if that is a thing that exists. Encouraging a child to think that they are in the wrong body, surely abusive way of thinking, is it not, Simon?
Well, I mean, there are all sorts of problems with mermaids. You know, just in the past week, we've seen them having to dismiss a trustee who turned out to be a paedophile apologist. They're being investigated by the Charity Commission. They're being criticised quite rightly for dishing out damaging chest binders to children without their parents knowing. They've had a so-called moderated chat room that they ran, which they've had to close because it was appeared to be unsafe. But, you know, even if none of that had happened, the fundamental purpose of mermaids has to be questioned, because for them to be encouraging children to think that they are trapped in the wrong bodies, for them to be manipulating parents by holding the threat of suicide over their heads if they don't go along with their particular kind of political view of this, it's all very unpleasant, and they certainly have had an unprecedented influence, and they've been without scrutiny for a long time. Okay. Let's not forget the BBC were pushing people to mermaids. You had that ITV documentary that was heavily, drama, Butterfly, that was heavily influenced by mermaids.
I mean, that's your opinion, and I tend to agree with your opinion on that, Simon, but is it not the case that we should be supporting young people who feel like they are having transgender issues or dysphoria? How can we better support people if we're not sending them to charities like Mermaid? And I'll come back to you next, Peter, but Simon, if you can answer that first.
Well, yeah, of course you must support them. I mean, you know, what the evidence shows about people experiencing gender dysphoria, this great discomfort with their sex, is that they often have a complicated mesh of mental health conditions. So, of course, they need to be properly supported. They need people who understand them, to listen to them, and people who can help them, as any good therapist does, to come to terms with reality, to come to terms with the world and themselves the way they really are. The problem with mermaids is that they don't do that. They take the child's misapprehension that they are trapped in the wrong body, and they say, "You're right, and we're going to give you every help to try and change your body to match those feelings." That's completely approaching it the wrong way round.
OK, Peter, I take it you have a different opinion on this and you think mermaids is a good thing. Can you expand on why you think chest binders and puberty blockers and the approaches that mermaids promotes could be a good thing for children?
Well, first of all, mermaids does not in any way pressure, encourage or persuade young people to be trans. It listens to young people. And we are told time and time again that we must listen to young people. You know, when young people feel strongly a particular way, we should not dismiss that. We should listen and hear what they're saying. And of course, mermaids and other charities, they talk through these issues with young people. They don't just accept it at face value and then try and push them into puberty blockers or chest binders. They talk it through very thoroughly, as do the parents. And often, in most cases, parents are involved with mermaids as well. Mermaids brings in the parents, so the parents are involved in the decision-making process.
No, I've got to say at this point, what are we hearing from parents?
Let me finish, Simon. With regard to chest binders, that is true that Mermaids does provide chest binders to young trans girls. That's absolutely true. But they do so with safety instructions, and they don't just hand them out willy-nilly. They have to have evidence that that child needs them. And of course, if Mermaids did not provide chest binders, there's a very real danger that many young kids would make their own and not use them properly and safely. So I think it's very responsible.
Is there a way for a child to be using chest binders safely? That's the problem. You said Mermaids listens, but the problem could be, from my opinion, that they affirm rather than just listening. And it's not about not dismissing, but it's not about encouraging a young person in their dysphoria. Simon, what would be your alternative take on what Peter just said?
Well, I just want to say what we hear from parents is that Mermaids is the problem, that when their kids get in with Mermaids and with that worldview, the parents can feel that they lose all connection with their child. Their child is just reinforced in this kind of political approach to their mental health issues. And parents have to band together to help one another to know how to deal with the enormous pressure that they and their children come under from this ideology. So I don't think, the idea that Mermaids is a kind of a pro-parenting organisation, I don't think that's a fair account of the work that they do. No, look, I mean, Tavistock Clinic, again, you have whistleblowers from Tavistock Clinic who were saying that the kids and families who were involved with mermaids were coming to them. And again, that mermaids involvement was putting pressure on the clinic and people at the clinic to affirm the child in their choice of changing gender, to affirm them in their wish for puberty blockers and so on. It's a very dangerous and damaging ideology. I think we can be relieved that it's finally getting the scrutiny it deserves. But we really have to look at this whole approach to the issue of trans, not just at some of the problems of the way Mermaids is operating day to day.
Peter, do you think it's fitting Peter, do you think it's fitting that celebrities like Jamil and Emma Watson are supporting such a charity when it's a heavily contested area, and we're seeing damage from Simon rightly recommended or talked about the example of chat rooms and the damage being done there, but also puberty blockers, chest binders, all of the things that could be considered abusive by many. Do you think it's right for celebrities to be endorsing this?
Well, first of all, Simon is wrong to say that Mermaids is a political charity. It's not. This is about human rights, human dignity, respect for young people and their parents.
Which human rights is it about?
It's quite true that some parents may have disagreements and may have had bad experiences. That could well be true. But the vast majority say that they, as parents, are very happy with the way in which their children have been supported by Mermaids. It's not political, it's not pressured, it's by choice, and it's made those kids happier and better and more fulfilled.
I'm sorry, but I have to contest that as well. You can't say that it's not a political movement when it's a heavily contested ideology, and that the vast majority of people for the last 2,000 plus years have considered that you are your gender and you are born as your gender. You are either male or female. Now, to suggest that young people could be born in the wrong body and have a dysphoria about that is a very modern idea. It is a very contested idea. That makes it political. It's not settled in science.
Well, you're absolutely wrong. Trans people have been around all throughout history, going back thousands and thousands of years.
I never said that trans people haven't been around.
Yeah.
So what am I wrong about?
Trans people have been around for a long time. This is not some new ideology. This is about human dignity and respect, respecting people who are different from ourselves. And, providing there is no pressure and people are not being forced or unfairly or unwarrantedly encouraged that to be trans, I think we should respect the work that Mermaids does. And, we just have to look at the results. Most trans children and most parents of trans children say they are very happy with Mermaids, that their children's lives...
We can't back that data up either. What we can see is that there's possibly a social contagion going on when we see that the number of kids identifying as trans or with trans dysphoria at the moment is massively increasing at a rate like we have never seen before. You can sit there and say there've always been trans people, but not at the number that we're seeing right now. So is it an increase because of a fad? And should we be allowing people to put their children through irreversible procedures by affirming their delusions? Is that an appropriate method?
Most of the procedures are not irreversible, and the arguments you've used about this huge increase, that's the same thing that happened or was said when gay people began to come out. People said, oh, where are all these gay people coming from? There never used to be gay people before. There was just a little tiny minority. Now
I'm sorry, that's a nonsense argument that no one's making. All right, Simon, I'm going to put a question to you, because we would always argue for and against, but for the most part, the most important thing here is the child, surely, Simon?
Yes, I've got to pick up on something Peter said. Peter said that most of the interventions are reversible. That's demonstrably untrue. The very reason why everybody's now so worried about puberty blockers is that it's not reversible. It causes permanent damage, and everybody's now having to admit that. And certainly in terms of surgery, that's not reversible, is it? And what are we finding now? I mean, we need to hear from the voices of detransitions, the people who have followed the Mermaids type line and deeply, deeply regret it and can't go back. They've had the hormones, they've had the surgery, and they can't undo it. And anyone who's heard those stories will know that it breaks your heart. So the idea that it's reversible is just such utter rubbish. No, we have to focus on the best interests of children. And we have to focus on listening to children and on providing them with the proper advice and, where appropriate, therapy to help them to accept themselves and to love themselves the way they are, rather than telling them that they need to pump their bodies full of drugs, have irreversible surgeries, and make themselves lifelong patients in order to try to get their bodies to match their feelings.
Therapy, not affirmation.
No child can have,
wise words
no
indeed. Thank you.
child
That
can
was
have irreversible
LGBT
surgery.
activist Peter Thatchell, the Deputy Director of the Christian Institute, Simon Calvert. Thank you both very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Mermaids has responded to the recent allegations with the following statement. We're in the midst of a targeted, cynical attack on mermaids. The safety and well-being of our service users is paramount, and our systems are designed to automatically flag anything that may be a concern. If a young person is identified as being specifically vulnerable, their post will not be shared, and in line with our safeguarding procedures, this will be escalated and actioned accordingly. One thing that is a danger to the next generation is the content they can see online. And the father of 14-year-old Molly Russell, who took her own life 5 years ago, says there is no time for delay in legislating to stop children seeing harmful content online. He wants to see the introduction of the Online Safety Bill, which aims to lay down rules in law about how platforms should deal with harmful content. But the idea of the Online Safety Bill has been divisive. So my next debate is, how crucial are new internet safety laws, and is that the right method of making a difference in this area? Joining me now on the phone is John Carr OBE, the Secretary of UK's Children's Charities Coalition on Internet Safety, and Toby Young, General Secretary at the Free Speech Union. John, in terms of safeguarding our children, how crucial do you think the Online Safety Bill is? Well, Toby's on the screen at the moment, so I'll ask Toby the same question. Toby, is this an appropriate method of protecting children online using the Online Safety Bill?
I think the difficulty with the bill, Calvin, is it goes far beyond what it needs to do in order to make the internet safer for children. I don't think any of the bill's opponents, certainly no one amongst the free speech advocacy world, doesn't think that big tech social media companies could do more to keep children safe online. But there's no reason why the Online Safety Bill couldn't be turned into the Children's Online Safety Bill and achieve that object. The problem is that it goes far beyond that. And the most infamous way in which it does that is that it asks the big social media companies, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, to address in their terms and conditions how they're going to deal with content that is legal but harmful to adults. So the bill doesn't just ask the big social media companies to enforce the law and remove unlawful content. It goes beyond that and effectively asks them what they're going to do about lawful but harmful content, what's been described as lawful but awful. And the problem is that that is, in the words of Lord Sumption, stratospherically vague. The government, instead of actually specifying what it regards as legal but harmful content to adults, is going to stipulate it in a statutory instrument, and includes, it's given an indicative list of what's going to be in this statutory instrument, and it includes things like health-related misinformation. In other words, anyone challenging the safety and effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccines or questioning the wisdom of the lockdown policy is going to find their content removed on pain of being fined by Ofcom, the internet, the big social media companies, if they don't remove it after this bill becomes law, unless the legal clause
This is the problem then, isn't it? I'm sure you would agree, John, that we all want to challenge the social media content that children are exposed to, and we all want protections in place, but this is going above and beyond. It almost feels like anti-free speech has been shoehorned into a bill that should be protecting children and is actually harmful to adults by using that terminology, legal but harmful. John, where do you fall on this?
Well, in a sense, I don't have a dog in that fight. My concern is with the safety and well-being of children. And so to that extent, if they want to change the bill around to make it more expressly directed at children, I don't have a problem with it. What I don't want to see is this fight delaying it further. Let's not forget, if Boris Johnson hadn't suddenly had to resign as Prime Minister and the government went into suspended animation, the bill would already be, well, it wouldn't necessarily quite be law, but it would be a lot further on than it is now. And we've been waiting for it for far too long.
So, Toby, how do we get that to that point? Because I think we're all in agreement here that we want to protect children online, but the last thing we want to do is stifle free speech and prevent people from potentially challenging tyrannous government policies. So how do we get to that point?
Well, I think the government needs to take a long, hard look at this bill. And John's wrong, I'm afraid. The bill did need to be paused because it was very poorly drafted, and we would have ended up with some very poor legislation had it not been paused. I'll give you one example, Calvin. One of the clauses in the bill says that big social media companies, once the bill becomes law, will not only have to remove content that's unlawful in their particular part of the United Kingdom, but remove content that's unlawful in any part of the United Kingdom. Now, we know that in Scotland, vast swathes of things it's perfectly legal to say in the rest of the United Kingdom became criminalised when the Hate Crime and Public Order Act was passed last year. Now, as written, the bill will mean that Ofcom will threaten the big social media companies with fines of up to 10% of their global turnover if they don't remove content from their platforms in the rest of the United Kingdom that's unlawful in Scotland. Effectively, the bill promotes Nicola Sturgeon to be the content moderator for the whole of the United Kingdom. That's an example of just one example of how poorly drafted this bill is. So we do need to take a look at it. We do need to revise it. It needs to come back, hopefully, just as a children's online safety bill, which will achieve what John wants it to achieve without in any way encroaching on our right to free speech.
Okay, so final word to John on this, because I think we've put pressure on these big tech companies and we're asking the government to intervene. Is there not an argument to be made that parents need to take more responsibility on what their children are accessing online and whether children should even have unsupervised access to the internet and social media?
Of course, parents need to be engaged, but, you know, these big companies pump billions and billions of pounds into advertising and promoting themselves and creating spaces where children feel massively pressured to be present. So to then say, but actually then it's all down to the parents to make sure their kids are safe, it just doesn't work. It's the deceit.
Okay, well, thank you very much, both of you. That was Toby Young from the Free Speech Union and John Carr, OBE. Thanks for your time today. You are watching Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson. I'll be back with you after a short break. Deus Volt.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry towards the southeast, but wind and rain spreading in from the northwest. Let's home in on that detail. So starting off in the southwest then, and here, a mostly fine end to the day, but it will turn cloudier and windier ahead of some rain arriving overnight. Also a fine picture in the southeast, late sunshine, then clear skies after dusk, rain arriving there by the end of the evening. Wind and rain already reaching northern and western parts of Wales by 7 o'clock this evening, but drier towards the southeast, particularly around the Swansea area. It'll also be a largely dry start to the evening across the Midlands. That rain pushing in overnight, meaning everyone will have some wet and windy weather for a time. And a similar picture across the northeast of England, where the rain will be starting to push in, but won't affect most people until overnight. The winds strengthening and clouds building ahead of it. Meanwhile, taking a look at Scotland, the rain will have already cleared northern and western parts with clear, colder air feeding in, a wet and windy end to the day in the south and east. And the heavy rain also largely clearing Northern Ireland, where it will then be mostly dry through the night, under clear skies turning quite chilly as well. Looking at the national picture overnight, you can see how the rain will progress southeastwards with a few showers following on, and that's how the weather's shaping up for this evening.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness, brilliant. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hello and welcome back. You are watching Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson, on your TV, radio and online. This hour we'll be discussing whether or not the Conservative Party really needs a dedicated group for black Conservatives. I'll also be joined by a Just Stop Oil spokesman because I bumped into their protest on Friday. But first, here's the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Calvin, thank you. At 3 o'clock, our top story. A community is in shock and tributes are being paid to 10 people who lost their lives in an explosion at a petrol station in County Donegal in Ireland on Friday. They've been named as Leona Harper, James O'Flaherty, Martin McGill, Robert Garwood and his daughter Shauna, Jessica Gallagher, Martina Martin, also Catherine O'Donnell and her son James, and Hughie Kelly, all among those who lost their lives in the small, tight-knit community of Creesler in County Donegal. The Taoiseach, Michael Martin, visited the site of the explosion last evening, and he said the entire nation is in mourning following the tragedy. The Irish authorities, meanwhile, are continuing their investigations, but still maintain the explosion looks as if it was just a tragic accident. Other news today, and Russia is assessing the damage on its only bridge to occupied Crimea after a huge blast destroyed large parts of it yesterday. President Vladimir Putin has ordered the country's Federal Security Service, the SFB, to now guard the key connector to the occupied peninsula. Traffic flow has resumed along part of the route, and the Kremlin has ordered repair work to begin immediately. Ukraine previously said the crossing was a military target, but haven't claimed responsibility for the attack. Meanwhile, at least 13 people have been killed and around 49 people, including 6 children, are in hospital after shelling in the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia. Residential buildings were damaged in 12 Russian missile strikes, according to the governor of the region. The authorities say a rescue operation currently underway. Here, barristers are voting on whether to end strike action after receiving a pay offer from the government. The offer includes reforms to set fees for legal aid work and an investment of £54 million in the criminal bar. That's according to the Ministry of Justice. The vote closes at midnight tonight. Now, the Scottish National Party's conference is taking place in Aberdeen this weekend. Let's take you live there now, where our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, has been sifting through events for us. Darren, what's been happening today and what are we expecting over the next 24 hours?
Well, Paul, I've just been listening, actually, in the hall to John Sweeney, who is essentially Nicola Sturgeon's Deputy First Minister here in Scotland, and he had a pretty strong attack line on the Conservative Party, talking about how Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's budget effectively had been ruinous for Scotland, and that the Conservatives could not be trusted when it comes to economic competence. There was also attacks on Labour as well, but the main thread of the speech, and we've noticed this all weekend, has been this big issue of Scottish independence. Of course, the SNP would argue that they've got a mandate following last year's Holyrood elections to call for another referendum. Westminster at the moment is saying that is not going to happen, and that is why this week the Supreme Court is going to get involved when it's going to look at the arguments about who has got the right to potentially call an election. Nicola Sturgeon wants to see one in October 2023. 2023, so in around a year's time. Fascinating, isn't it? Yes, the cost of living crisis is an issue here. Of course it is, along with energy security. But it is that big constitutional issue that is again dominating politics at this party conference.
But would you say, though, Darren, that IndyRef2 and the focus on it could end up making bad PR for the SNP when people are worried about the cost of living crisis and other issues they would argue would be more important?
Yeah, indeed, Polly, there are a lot of people elsewhere in the country, as in Scotland, who think that the SNP government should be focusing on their own record. Nicola Sturgeon should be looking at what the SNP have done in government, because there are challenges here around school standards, around the National Health Service, and frankly also about the standard of living when it comes to people's abilities here in this country with their economics. But in the end, the SNP would continually put the argument that they have been elected successively by the Scottish people on this ticket of Scottish independence, that they want another referendum, and that is what the people of Scotland want. Now, the opinion polls are pretty divided in all of this. In fact, there's polls suggesting that actually people don't believe a referendum should be held now. And also, you were right in saying that, the Labour, Conservative Party, Liberal Democrats here in Scotland are saying Nicola Sturgeon should be focused on those other issues, those politics of today, particularly at this moment in time, rather than on that constitutional question. But be in no doubt, you talk to delegates here, it is the issue that they feel this party is all about and why they want to achieve it.
Is there any chance, do you think, Darren, in your assessment, that speechwriters could be making last-minute adjustments to Nicola Sturgeon's keynote speech tomorrow in view of that concern that it's not all about IndyRef2?
I don't think so. I mean, in many ways, actually, Nicola Sturgeon's got nothing really new to say about the independence referendum. The reason I say that is because she's already mapped out that she wants to have this referendum in October of next year. They're prepared to go through to see what the Supreme Court have to say about that. There is a Plan B option, which is essentially to use the general election in 2024 as a kind of quasi kind of referendum, if you like, on Scottish independence if the Supreme Court rules against them. So we know that plan. Clearly it plays well here. Clearly they think they've got a mandate for it. But yes, I mean, John Sweeney's speech, don't get me wrong, there was a lot of talk about the problems within the Conservative Party, a lot of talk about Keir Starmer's leadership of Labour and their backing of Brexit, if you like. And we will hear more of that from Nicola Sturgeon. I'm just trying to emphasise that maybe unsurprisingly, the politics here in Scotland is different, that the constitutional question is the kind of the rock through which politics is still talked about here and has been for the last 10 or 15 years. And that, frankly, is not changing this weekend.
Darren, thank you. Darren McCaffrey there at the Scottish National Party's conference in Aberdeen for us. Now, international news, and in Iran, 185 people, including 19 children, are said to have died in protests across the country over the last 3 weeks. Demonstrations began in mid-September after the funeral of Mahsa Amini, who died after she was detained by the so-called morality police over allegations she was wearing her hijab too loosely in public. According to Iran Human Rights, hundreds of women and girls from high schools and universities have all been taking part in protests right across the country over the last 3 weeks, despite allegations of brutal treatment towards them and accusations the authorities are using tear gas and live ammunition to disperse them. And finally, Buckingham Palace has released a new image of one of the Queen's favourite ponies. If you're watching on television, you'll be able to see Emma, the fell pony, 26 years old herself, we understand. She was part of the procession at the Queen's state funeral and, you may remember, stood next to the long walk to Windsor Castle as Her Majesty the Queen's coffin was driven past. Well, the palace is saying, to accompany that image, that Emma will continue to be looked after and much loved and cared for in Windsor, as the Queen would have wanted. That's it. You're up to date on GB News. More news as it happens.
Hello and welcome back. This is my brand new show, The Common Sense Crusade, with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson. Coming up in this hour, we have a new group of black conservatives called the 2022 Group, was launched this week at Conservative Party Conference. But do we really need these identity politics organisations in the party? Just Stop Oil protesters blocked off all the roads into Trafalgar Square by gluing themselves to the road. Is there any hope for stopping these eco-zealots? And hate crimes are on the rise, according to the latest figures, with a rise of 26% on last year. But with only a small proportion of these offences being solved, is British policing broken? And of course, you can join in any of our discussions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet @gbnews. It's time now for Calvin's Concern segment, where we take a brief moment to see what you've been saying about the stories we've talked about so far and what you've been finding troubling this week. Well, this week a student union has come under fire after it banned white students from attending its Black History Month events, sparking accusations of racial segregation. I took to Twitter to say, sorry to see Westminster Student Union implementing racial segregation at the University of Westminster. Well-intentioned activists are trying to create safe spaces and inadvertently stoking racial tensions where there may not have existed to begin with. Well, many of you had plenty to say about this, and Simon got in touch to say, whose idea was this segregation? Why would a black student only want to discuss their history with another black person and not a white person? I mean, fair point, Simon, but I'd probably say, what is black history? Why would anyone want to address black history in the first place? Surely history is history. And in this country, the United Kingdom, we teach history based on English history, UK history, European history, world history. We don't teach white history. So why would we teach black history? It makes no sense. Janine says, race relations have been steadily improving in Western democracies for many years until recently, when measures like this have started having regressive consequences. Absolutely. I think you're spot on, Janine. The problem is people don't see that this is regressive. They think they are being progressive. And what they are doing is implementing segregation. Imagine a university, and this is my alma mater, by the way, which is why I'm especially upset about it, segregating people out based on their skin colour. Lisa got in touch to say, these events do not have the purpose of exclusion any more than women-only events. Why would any white person want to go to an event that is specifically for people who experience being black every day of their lives? How do you experience being black, Lisa? I'd love for you to expand on that. I happen to have brown skin. You can call me a person of colour, mixed race, whatever you want. Some people call me black. I don't know how I live that experience every day of my life. It's just a fact. It's an immutable characteristic, doesn't dictate my lifestyle or anything about me. Interesting thought take there. Billy got in touch to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Black History Month about making the history of black people more visible to a wider audience? This seems to be defeating the purpose somewhat. Again, interesting take. Is that what black history is all about? Or is it more diversity? And diversity has come to mean less white more than anything. It used to mean adding to, and now it seems to mean taking away. So I'm not convinced that it is actually well-intentioned. As charitable as I was trying to be in my tweet, is that the case? Who knows? In reaction to this story, a University of Westminster spokesman said, one of the university's key Black Lives Matter commitments was to eliminate all gaps associated with success measures for all BME students. Black History Year creates an intensive career-defining program aimed at addressing disparities amongst black students. Does exactly that. Equality of opportunity does not always mean giving everyone access to the same thing. It means creating a level playing field by offering some programs to those who are underrepresented or those who have had less access to opportunity. I'm sorry, they just contradicted themselves. Equality of opportunity does mean enabling everyone to have the same entry point. It does not mean lowering the player field or bringing everyone down to the least common denominator. What are they talking about? That's all we've got time for this week's Calvin's Concern, but do please continue to tweet at GB News. Plenty more to come this afternoon on Common Sense Crusade. In a moment, we will be talking about the Conservative Party. The PM Liz Truss will be calling on the Tory party to come together and stop infighting next week. But first, let's have a look at the weather. Deus Vult.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry towards the southeast, but wind and rain spreading in from the northwest. Let's home in on that detail. So starting off in the southwest then, and here, a mostly fine end to the day, but it will turn cloudier and windier ahead of some rain arriving overnight. Also a fine picture in the southeast, late sunshine, then clear skies after dusk, rain arriving there by the end of the evening. Wind and rain already reaching northern and western parts of Wales by 7 o'clock this evening, but drier towards the southeast, particularly around the Swansea area. It'll also be a largely dry start to the evening across the Midlands. That rain pushing in overnight, meaning everyone will have some wet and windy weather for a time. And a similar picture across the northeast of England, where the rain will be starting to push in, but won't affect most people until overnight. The winds strengthening and clouds building ahead of it. Meanwhile, taking a look at Scotland, the rain will have already cleared northern and western parts with clear, colder air feeding in, a wet and windy end to the day in the south and east. And the heavy rain also largely clearing Northern Ireland, where it will then be mostly dry through the night, under clear skies, turning quite chilly as well. Looking at the national picture overnight, you can see how the rain will progress southeastwards, with a few showers following on, and that's how the weather's shaping up for this evening.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness, brilliant. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson. Now, Liz Truss will issue a stark warning to Tory MPs returning to Parliament this week to stop undermining her or face a monstrous coalition of Labour and the SNP. According to the Sunday Times, Cabinet Ministers are planning to ambush the Prime Minister in a meeting on Tuesday to demand that she rules out raising benefits in line with wages rather than inflation. But without the full backing of the party, will Truss's plan to grow the economy succeed? With me now to discuss this further is Conservative commentator and author Joanne Nadler. Joanne, welcome to the show. First of all, is the Tory party in the midst of a civil war?
Well, it would seem so. It seems to be having a collective nervous breakdown, doesn't it? I mean, they're fighting like rats in a sack. It doesn't really matter, it seems, whether they're on the backbenches or in the cabinet. And this is an absolute death spiral, quite frankly, for the Conservative Party. It really, really does have to pull itself together. It's indulged itself tremendously over the last 2 months anyway, with this very lengthy leadership election. And one of the arguments in favour of having such a lengthy process was that it could have these big philosophical arguments legitimately during that process. But having finished that process, they now really have to get on with the job in hand. And this is just, it's hopeless, frankly.
What do you see the divide as? Because I was at a Conservative Party conference and I saw a divide between the wets and the people on the right of the party, as I would define it. What do you see the problem as?
I think it's more complicated than that, because I think quite a lot of this is simply to do with personalities. I mean, if you look at today's papers, there seems to be, quite frankly, ridiculous briefings against various people based on the fact that they've got apparently, particular personality faults and traits. And that's something we definitely don't need to see in the papers. And I think is redolent, frankly, of a party that feels it's about to lose power and it's lost all self-restraint. But philosophically, I think there are some big unresolved issues arising out of Brexit and what kind of Brexit the Conservative Party wants to deliver. And obviously, under Boris Johnson, he managed to pull together various different, perhaps conflicting ideas about how big the state should be. And he packaged it up all in this idea of levelling up. Now, we've not once heard the new Prime Minister even refer to the phrase levelling up. And I think that's left a lot of people wondering what her priorities are, even though it was quite difficult to define exactly what levelling up meant. But there's a sense in which what she wants to bring in is a much more liberalising economic set of policies and perhaps leave behind some of those more cultural issues, which, though Boris Johnson was slow to get to, one felt his government was perhaps more sympathetic towards.
It does feel like there's a lack of discipline in the party. What kind of measures can the government put in place to make sure the ministers fall in line?
Well, I mean, there's nothing, in terms of discipline in a party, nothing works better than actually being determined to deliver discipline, if you like. And although I know many people feel that Conor Burns was treated rather unfairly last week, and that may be the case in terms of natural justice, nonetheless, the fact that the complaints against him were dealt with so swiftly by the Prime Minister did at least suggest that she wanted to reinforce the idea that she's in charge and that her appointees are in charge and they have to fall into line. And I think perhaps in a way he was treated more harshly than he might otherwise have been because of the general chaos that's swirling around the party at the moment. So you need the personnel, but also you need basically to show that what you say counts and that you can't get away with sort of speaking out of turn. Now, what we saw during the conference, unfortunately, was quite a lot of very senior people speaking out of turn, and they're still in post. So frankly, there is no point in talking about discipline if you're not prepared to enforce it.
Yes, and we have seen at least 4 senior ministers come out and say, please get behind Truss. So they're trying at least from one perspective. But what is the issue here? What are the policies that we're battling against? The benefits plan, for example.
Well, there's a big dilemma, it seems, that Liz Truss has talked a lot about how she's trying to reinforce the idea that actually her government will be fiscally responsible. And one way she has mooted of doing that is to restrict the growth in the benefits budget by capping benefits in line with the increase in general income rather than in inflation, which of course many people see as and would actually result in view of the rate of inflation, benefits actually having a real term cut. So this is a big argument that's still got to play out, and a lot of people are briefing that they won't support her in that. And of course, we saw her U-turn over the top rate of tax because she was told she simply wouldn't get it through the House of Commons. And, you know, we may be facing a similar thing this week over this particular measure as well.
Absolutely, and the Home Secretary today has warned of the consequences of infighting, saying that it could lead to Keir Starmer or Sturgeon getting into power. Do you think this is going to be the case?
Well, I fear very much that it's looking that way because apart from anything else, the Conservative Party doesn't look as if it really wants to lead at the moment. It doesn't seem to know what it stands for anymore. It doesn't seem to be prepared to get behind a Prime Minister whom they have only very recently selected. I mean, it's only a month since Liz Truss became the Prime Minister. This is just quite unprecedented, the degree of U-turning and flip-flopping and lack of discipline that we're seeing over this period. I don't recall anything quite like it at this point in somebody's premiership. Of course, I worked for the Conservative Party during part of the John Major leadership, and that was a very gradual decline and a lack of discipline in the party. But it didn't play out in such a dramatic way within the course of a month. So to answer your question about do I think it's likely that we might see a Labour and SNP coalition, I think it's being made ever more likely by the day if the Conservative Party doesn't get its act together.
And one last question, Joanne. How can we make the Conservative Party conservative again?
Well, I think people like you and like myself, we have to argue for those principles that we hold dear, and also to show that they're not just principles that have no practical value in people's lives. That a lot of the issues that you raise on the programme and the one here's discussed elsewhere on GB News, they really have a very important impact on people's lives. And that these are critical issues that, quite frankly, if we were to see an SNP-Labour coalition, we might never be able to turn the clock back on. So I think the point is we keep up the pressure and we show why these things matter in people's lives.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much. That was Conservative commentator and author Joanne Nadler. Now, Just Stop Oil have participated in another climate activist protest, or you could call it a climate extremist protest, this time by blocking off all the roads from Trafalgar Square in London. The group glued themselves to the road and blocked traffic before being arrested by police. The group called for an end to the government licensing and producing more fossil fuel emissions and have been at the centre of numerous high-profile actions in the last few months. Joining me now is Just Stop Oil spokesman Oliver Clegg. Oliver, what was Just Stop Oil hoping to achieve with these actions?
Yes, really, so you said it. We are demanding that the government immediately halt any new fossil fuel licensing, and we hope that they make a statement saying they're going to do that.
And so do you think that blocking the roads and preventing emergency services from getting through and from people getting to work, and, you know, I spoke to someone who was trying to get to a funeral. Do you think that this...
We are not
I will give you time to answer the question, Oliver. I will let you answer, but you've got to let me finish the question. Do you think that these actions...
Yeah, sure, as long as you don't lie about it.
Do you... Sorry?
Yeah, sure, as long as you don't lie about it.
As long as I don't lie. I'm on here telling you what I experienced. I was there firsthand. The footage we're seeing on the screen right now is what I recorded. I was speaking to your protesters, I was speaking to the police, and I was speaking to people who were trying to get by their day-to-day lives, and someone was trying to get to their mother's funeral, and they weren't able to make it because of the protesters. Now, the question is, do you think that this is going to bring people on side to your argument?
Well, people are already on side. Overwhelmingly, the majority of people understand we're in a climate crisis and know that we need urgent action. Now, the question is, how do we turn that want for action on climate into genuine government action? And time again through history, then it's been shown that disruptive civil resistance has led to change.
Has your organisation ever achieved one of its goals?
Well, our organisation is very much hoping that it is going to achieve its goals, but we're in our infancy. We've only existed for 6 months, and when you look at the polling, you can see that more people now are wanting to step up into civil resistance. So I think we can say that it is in a really good trajectory.
Oliver, you said you wanted to hear the truth. I would expect you to speak the truth too. You haven't just been in existence for 6 months, have you? The truth of the matter is that this is another Roger Hallam offshoot, isn't it? And that you're part of a wider, broader organisation of many, many extreme protest groups. This is not just a brand new organisation, is it?
God, I don't know what you're talking about, this conspiracy bullshit.
I'm sorry, I will not tolerate that kind of language. We are live on air, pre-Watershed. Do not come on here and start swearing. We're going to move on to the next question. If you can please refrain from that. How can you convince people that this is a serious issue when, as we're seeing on the footage right here, we're seeing people talking about an LGBT crisis is the same as a fuel crisis? Can you please explain to viewers and listeners how those issues are the same?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen that in natural disasters and indeed in human-driven climate disasters, then there have been LGBT people implanted far greater than their straight and cisgender counterparts would have been. And so for LGBT people, it is crucial for our very
Okay, we're going to end this now.
Thank you
very much. That was Oliver Clegg, Just Stop Oil spokesperson. I want to really sincerely apologise because we have these people on to try and put their point across and they can't do so in a civilised way without swearing. We are not about that. We won't have him on again. It's disgusting. Now, before we got to the news headlines, before we get to them, let's have a look at what you guys have been saying about the topics we've been discussing today, including safeguarding. Linda says, Calvin, just because people work in supposedly respected professions doesn't mean they are respectable. As an example, look at Rotherham grooming gangs, whose supposed respectable and trusted professionals have allegedly shielded the perpetrators. Sad, sad truth of the matter, Linda. You are right on the nose there. The issue in Rotherham, in Telford, in Rochdale, in Blackpool, in many, many towns and cities across this country, Pakistani Muslim rape gangs have been getting away with it because the institutions such as the councils, such as the child protection officers, such as the police, as far up as the government have been covering this up, all under the name of diversity, and it's a great shame, and it's a great shame on our nation. We've been letting people down. Wendy says, thank you, Calvin, for raising awareness of these crucial issues. We must always be vigilant. That we must. We must adorn the armour of Ephesians 6. Jude says, only an independent body will sort this. Time and time again, the church has shown it cannot solve these issues by itself. You're right, unfortunately, Jude, and I do want to be clear, it's not just the church. We see this issue across the board in all aspects of lives, and it's not being stamped out, it's not being worked on hard enough, and it's a great shame on our nation. James got in touch to say, we need to be extremely careful what children are watching online. With no oversight, the family unit can be completely undermined in the digital age. That right there, James, is the crux of the matter for me, because we have many, many people with different agendas pushing content online towards our young people. And it's easy for us to sit here and say the police need to clamp down more, big tech need to do more, the government needs to do more. But the fact of the matter is, parents also need to do more. And I'm not standing here pointing a finger, but I'm saying young people should not be on the internet unsupervised. They should not have unsupervised access to the internet, because we know the dangers of the internet. And when I was in school, the vast majority of child protection issues we saw were young people exposed to things they should not be exposed to because they had these smartphones. They had unfettered access to the internet in their pocket at all times. Let's work on that, please. You are with GB News on TV, on radio and online. Next, we'll be discussing baby names. Noah and Olivia were the most popular last year. Mohammed was the most popular name in 4 out of 9 English regions. Now it's time for a check of the news headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
Calvin, thank you. The latest headlines. Pope Francis has offered his sincere condolences to the people of County Donegal after a service station explosion left 10 people dead. My apologies for the interference on sound. I'll repeat that for you. Pope Francis has offered his sincere condolences to the people of County Donegal in Ireland after a service station explosion left 10 people dead on yesterday. Leona Harper, James O'Flaherty, Martin McGill, Robert Garway and his daughter Shona, Jessica Gallagher, Martina Martin, Hughie Kelly, Catherine O'Donnell and her son James all lost their lives in the small community of Creesler, while the Irish authorities say the explosion is being treated as a tragic accident, although investigations are ongoing. Also today, Russia is assessing the damage on its only bridge to occupied Crimea after a huge blast destroyed large areas of it yesterday. President Vladimir Putin has ordered the country's Federal Security Service to now guard the key route to the occupied peninsula. Ukraine has previously said the crossing is a target, but has not claimed responsibility for the attack. 185 people, including 19 children, are said to have died in protests across Iran over the last 3 weeks. Demonstrations began last month following the death of Mahsa Amini, who was detained by the morality police over allegations she was wearing her hijab took too loosely. According to the Iran human rights group, hundreds of women and girls have taken part in protests across the country, despite accusations the authorities have used live ammunition to disperse them. And Buckingham Palace has released a new picture of one of the Queen's favourite ponies. If you're watching on television, this is Emma, a fell pony, 26 years old herself and part of the procession at the Queen's state funeral. She stood next to the long walk to Windsor Castle as Her Majesty's coffin was driven past. Well, the palace is saying Emma will continue to be much loved as the Queen would have wanted, and she'll be cared for in Windsor. That's it. You're up to date on TV, online and on DAB+ radio. You're with GB News. Don't go anywhere. Calvin is back in just a moment.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back to Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson. Speaking to the Black Conservative 2022 group at the Conservative Party conference this week, Northern Ireland Minister Steve Baker said the group was about us as equals, having equal opportunities and being friends together. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? But is there a need for a Black Conservative group? Joining me now to debate the matter is social and political commentator Lynn May and political commentator Emma Webb. Lynn, I'll start with you. Do you think there's a need for a Black Conservative group, and why?
I think there is a need, and when I saw this, that they decided to have this group, I was quite happy about this, because me being a conservative thinker myself, especially coming from an ethnic background, sometimes we tend to feel ostracised. We know, and we have to admit, that there has been racist undertones in the Conservative Party historically, and even though the law has changed massively to reflect, our current climate, to support ethnic minorities, historically, a lot of people's parents, grandparents are going to continue to tell their children, this is why we don't like the Conservative Party, even though times have changed. So, I think it's important that like-minded people, not that all ethnic minorities are the same, and just because you have brown skin doesn't mean you're all the same. However, it's a place that people can come together and reason and not feel ostracised if they feel ostracised from their own communities. So I think it's a positive thing. And when people suggest, this is identity politics, I think it's about intent. When it comes to the left, their identity politics is, steeped in victimisation. With this group, I don't think it's that at all. So I think it's positive.
Yeah, but I'm sure the left would say we have a good intent too. We want to unite people, and we say that black people must vote for us because we care about black people. Is it not still identity politics from the Conservative Party to say, look, this is a group for people of an ethnic minority status? And you said yourself, just because you're brown doesn't mean you think alike. Therefore, what is the point in it in 2022?
No, the point is that the Conservative Party, and this is me being a Conservative voter as well as a Labour voter and a Brexit Party voter. So, I don't commit to any party. However, my experience across the board is, sadly, the Conservative Party are not as welcoming. They're quite distant when it comes to ethnic minorities. And I think we need to understand that because of those historical issues within ethnic minority groups, that they need to feel that the Conservative Party are for them. And if we want to be able to win the next general election, especially get Sadiq Khan out of London, we're going to have to be communicative to those ethnic groups. And unfortunately, a lot of the areas are Labour strongholds. So they don't understand how it is to essentially be a Conservative or feel that they can even be a part of the Conservative Party.
All right, Emma, do you think we need to be playing the left at their own game? Is the Conservative Party distant to ethnic minorities, considering that the ethnic diversity of the cabinet is the most diverse we've ever seen in the country?
Yeah, I think I agree with one point that Lynn May has made, which is that there's a huge amount of value in people who feel that they perhaps can't express their conservative views in their own particular social context or groups. I think there's a huge amount of value in people being able to come together and to feel like they're surrounded by like-minded people. And I would never be against people's right to assemble, but I think that this is completely counterproductive. And this is true not just of this particular group, but of all groups that are based on a particular identity. The same goes for women's groups. I don't feel that I am particularly represented by an MP just because they are female. In fact, I think that the person who represents me most in Parliament probably is Kemi Badenoch and someone like Lee Anderson, for example, or John Hayes. So these are people who I agree with, and it has absolutely nothing to do with what identity characteristics they may share with me. And so I think actually, Calvin, you made a really important point on Twitter, and you were responding to another Conservative commentator who said essentially that this is a group for you, really, and you made the point that no one owns you. And I think that in that way, this is a kind of Faustian pact because it's playing into the left's narrative on this. If we want to have a group that is truly welcoming and focused on equality, then it should be along true civil rights lines, not along the lines that Steve Baker, I think, misappropriated Martin Luther King for. It should be based on people's character and not the colour of their skin, the content of their character. Okay. And so I think that is the route that we should be taking, rather than focusing on all of these splinter groups that focus on dividing people by their identities.
I tend to agree with you, Emma, but Steve Baker got up on stage there at that event and said that footballers taking a knee was a good thing and it was a sign of solidarity. But then Suella Braverman got on stage at the Conservative Party the next day and said that actually taking a knee was a sign of aligning yourself with Black Lives Matter, which is a neo-Marxist organisation and something that police shouldn't be doing because it's political. Lynn May, where do you fall on that?
No, I completely disagree with Steve Baker. We've always said that taking the knee is a political ideology. I understand that every footballer who did it was not politically motivated and they did want to support many people that feel disadvantaged, so that's why they did it. However, I'm strongly against that. But going back to what you said, at the end of the day, we want to win the next general election and we need votes. And whether we like it or not, when it comes to the next generation, popular culture is led, even though they're a very small minority in the United Kingdom, popular culture is led by ethnic minorities. You just have to go into a supermarket or into a club and listen to the music. So we want to be able, as a Conservative Party, to be open to ethnic minorities so they feel that, the Conservative Party is for me. It doesn't matter what happened historically. They're changing their strategy in terms of, some of the ignorance that they had, and they did have a lot of ignorance historically. And this is why I think it's a good thing.
OK. I'm going to put it back to you because we hear a lot about votes and we need to appeal to different people's votes. Surely we should be appealing to them based on values rather than their ethnic status.
Completely. And I think, going back to the point that you made about, the certain groups, particularly on the left, who think that they, this conservative commentator basically making you, as you said, acting as if they own you because they say that you are a black person or a person of color, and therefore thinking that you should have certain views or be in favor of certain things. And I think that the left take exactly that same position, that position of ownership. And I think that it's just a counterproductive way of going about things. And I think, Calvin, you've made the point perfectly, in the past that this should be about, the content of your character rather than the colour of your skin.
But it's completely different. I'm sorry to interject here. It's completely different. And I think I agree with so many of the things that Calvin says, and I'm agreeing with some of the things that you're saying. However, this is an idealistic way of looking at it. We would love to only be judged by the character of ourselves. We would love to not see race. We would love all of these things to take place. However, as I said, if you're going to look historically at some of the things that took place, that can't be eradicated just because now we think, oh, the law is this way, so now the law is going to be equally applied. We know it's not. We only have to look at the statistics and various different things, such as education, such as the issues with...
Well, I'm not going to take the debate in that direction because...
No, but I'm just saying, but based on...
I'm going to wrap that one up because we're moving on to a different topic, but we clearly do have equality under the law. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Lynn May.
It's not equally applied, though. It's not.
I'm sorry, but I'm not going to have that. That's Lynn May and Emma Webb. Thank you very much for your time today. Now, figures released this week show that Noah has overtaken Oliver as the most popular name for a baby boy in the country, whilst Olivia remained the most popular name for a baby girl for the 6th year in a row. They also revealed that Mohammed was the most popular name for a baby boy in 4 of England's 9 regions last year. To break down those figures, I'm joined by independent statistician and political commentator Jamie Jenkins. There he is. Hi, Jamie. Just quickly talk us through how, first of all, if Mohammed is the 5th most popular name in 5 of the 9 regions of England, MU Mohammed, is that accounting for all the different spellings of the name Mohammed?
No, so the way the ONS do the figures, and actually, Calvin, what's quite interesting, the ONS produce all these health figures, they produce all these economic figures, unemployment, and the like, and this is one of the most popular things, actually. The public do kind of come together for this baby names release. When I was working at the ONS, it was the big thing that would come out every year. It's all over the news, and people in the general public love it. Yeah, it only looks at the one spelling of Mohammed, which is the one with MU, and it's kind of risen over the last 20 years or so in terms of that one. If you put all the different spellings together, you get a much larger number. So they do take individual spellings and come up with that. But again, similar, you've got different spellings for some names like Martin and the like as well. So they only keep them separate. And what it kind of is reflecting with the rise of the name Mohammed in the statistics, and what you see it kind of leading in some parts of the country, is that among the Muslim community, there tends to be a less diverse range of names that are used. So they tend to go for a smaller pool of names when naming their children, whereas, say, other communities have a much, much richer, broader range of names. And that's kind of explains a little bit of what we've been seeing in the figures.
Thank you for clearing that up, Jamie. That was independent statistician and political commentator Jamie Jenkins. Thanks for your time today. Here to discuss the cultural implications of this story, I'm joined in the studio by none other than the Director of Orthodox Conservatives, Joseph Robertson. Joseph, what does this mean for our culture?
Well, I guess the question is, to rephrase that, what does it mean in terms of other cultures? Oh. So one thing I would say about a name, the poet said, what's in a name? I think we can take a lot from a name, can't we? We can look at cultural implications, racial implications, we can look at socioeconomic implications, but the reality is one name only becomes predominant because a figure is valued highly. That's what we see with people naming the royals, naming their children after royals, and we're seeing that now with a religious figure in Mohammed. And perhaps what we should be doing is congratulating that culture and actually adhering to something they believe in, because I think what we're really looking at is a lack of options for belief in this country.
So do we need to reaffirm our Christian roots?
Yes.
OK, nice.
I think that's a nice, clear answer. But I think the point is that this country has become too wishy-washy with its values and its principles. It doesn't know what it believes in. Yeah. The people who are naming their sons Mohammed do very much know what they believe in.
In your opinion, would you say we're under a pincer attack from the left with their woke values, from the right with Islamic values, and British values are being eroded in the middle?
Yes, I think that's true. I think it's also Another thing, I was watching your previous debate, on identity politics within the Conservative Party. I think this is something we're seeing now as the failed project of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism doesn't exist. It's an artificial concept. We have the nation state, and the nation state is based on cultural values. When we try to amalgamate or assimilate different cultures, that's when it all starts falling apart. And what rises to the top is the culture or the value system that genuinely believes in what they're doing throughout that. And we're seeing a byproduct of that now. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a core British value to tolerate people of other faiths than none.
Yes.
Absolutely. But when the predominant culture of Britain is no longer Christianity and the religion is replaced with either wokeness or Islam, will we still have that tolerance of other faiths than none?
Well, I don't think we will, because what happens is when you start to allow anything, people replace it with people attack that and they replace it with something that they do believe in. If we don't believe in anything, it will be replaced with people who believe in something, and we're not going to like that something because we're not used to that. I think the left lumping together, for instance, Islam and identity politics is absolutely ridiculous, because Islam would never tolerate most of the identity politics that they actually want to assimilate. So there's no conversation about the cross-section in these cultural issues. Cross-sectionality, there's something we can talk about, but this is a genuine cross-section. This is something that's not discussed in academia anymore. Everything's lumped together. So we need to do more.
I'm trying to think of a predominantly Islamic country that supports people of different faiths than none, one where Christianity isn't persecuted, and I'm struggling. That was Joseph Robertson from Orthodox Conservatives. Thank you for your time today. New reports show hate crimes in England and Wales have increased by 26% in the last year, but it seems police are only persecuting a tiny proportion of these crimes. The increase in reported hate crimes is the largest it has been in 5 years, but stats on unsolved misdemeanours is sitting at around 8% of recorded offences. With me now is Mike Neville, former Detective Chief Inspector. Mike, thanks for joining us. What is a hate crime?
Well, it's any crime which is motivated against somebody by a different race, their religion, their disability, etc., etc. So true hate crimes are very wicked crimes. But of course, what we've got to take into account is that the problem with this the police face is that we see all sorts of things reported as hate crimes, people putting memes on Facebook or something like that. The case of Harry Miller was taken to court for putting a poem on Twitter. And somehow the police have got to fish out what is the real dangerous crimes and what really are nonsense and spats between individuals.
I argue that it's difficult for hate to ever be a crime unless it's inciting violence against somebody, because these days it seems like everyone belongs to a marginalised group, and if the whole point of hate crime is to protect a marginalised group and everyone is part of a marginalised group, then how do you balance which group needs protection more than others?
I'm absolutely with you on this, Calvin. And the difficulty is, of course, is that people realise is that they say it's a hate crime, they're more likely to get a better service from the police. So the more average you are, the more ordinary you are, that if you've got no sort of card to play, me, for example, as a white heterosexual man, I've got no cards to play. And some people will cynically use that. But of course, if there is real hate crime, say targeting Jewish people or whatever, these are with violence or vandalism or that sort of thing, this has got to be sorted out. But the police are distracted by their attempts to appear woke and policing the most petty of spats that you will get, as we've seen recently.
You mentioned Harry Miller, a good case to talk about there, but also Caroline Farrow this week has had the police clamping down on her in what looks like tyranny for her thoughts and words, if they were even her thoughts and words. How is it that we see almost a two-tier policing when it comes to hate crimes, as in certain demographics are targeted more than others?
Well, it just seems to me that the police are they've been desperate to appear as politically correct as they can. I mean, fortunately, no, I think we've got the first Conservative Home Secretary in a dozen years who is now telling the police to focus on burglary and things that impact on everybody, whether they're male or female, black or white, gay or straight. But the police have gone through decades now of senior officers having to show how, as I say, politically correct, woke they are to get promoted. And this filters down to the junior officers. And we see the incident like in Surrey where the lady was, on a Sunday afternoon. What are the police busying themselves on a Sunday afternoon with somebody who they know where she lives, who's allegedly put something on Facebook? It could have been dealt with in a far better manner than arresting her in front of her children while there's 3% of burglaries being solved in the same county.
Absolutely. And should the police be getting involved in, for example, Pride Parade? Should they have rainbow flags on them? Should they be twerking at Notting Hill Carnival? Should they be taking a knee at Black Lives Matter? Should all this be happening, Mike?
Calvin, absolutely not. The police must be absolutely apolitical. They must be impartial. What message does it send? Let's say there's a violent dispute between some gay rights activists or a Catholic priest or an imam, and the police officer turns up wearing a rainbow badge. What does that say? It doesn't say, I'm going to be impartial and deal with this incident. Taking the knee, it just sends all the wrong messages.
Absolutely.
Luckily, we now seem to have a Home Secretary who's getting a grip of this.
Hear, hear. Thank you. That was Mike Neville, former Detective Chief Inspector. Thank you very much. Now, my new documentary launched this morning entitled Indoctrination: How Woke Conquered the Classroom. Here's a brief taster.
They suspected I was anti-LGBT, anti-diversity, equality and inclusion, and that this needed to be treated possibly to the point that I should be banned from contacting the school.
You can catch the whole thing on the YouTube channel for New Culture Forum, where we tackle wokeness in the classroom. We talk to teachers, we talk to parents, we talk to governors, and we look at what's being indoctrinated in the young minds of our kids in classrooms today. You've been watching Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'll be back next week at 2 p.m. and Nana Okoye is up next. But before that, though, here is the weather. Day as fault. God bless.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry towards the southeast, but wind and rain spreading in from the northwest. Let's home in on that detail. So starting off in the southwest then, and here, a mostly fine end to the day, but it will turn cloudier and windier ahead of some rain arriving overnight. Also a fine picture in the southeast, late sunshine, then clear skies after dusk, rain arriving there by the end of the evening. Wind and rain already reaching northern and western parts of Wales by 7 o'clock this evening, but drier towards the southeast, particularly around the Swansea area. It'll also be a largely dry start to the evening across the Midlands. That rain pushing in overnight, meaning everyone will have some wet and windy weather for a time. And a similar picture across the northeast of England, where the rain will be starting to push in, but won't affect most people until overnight. The winds strengthening and clouds building ahead of it. Meanwhile, taking a look at Scotland, the rain will have already cleared northern and western parts with clear, colder air feeding in, a wet and windy end to the day in the south and east. And the heavy rain also largely clearing Northern Ireland, where it will then be mostly dry through the night, under clear skies turning quite chilly as well. Looking at the national picture overnight, you can see how the rain will progress southeastwards, with a few showers following on, and that's how the weather's shaping up for this evening.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Good afternoon and welcome. This is GB News on TV, online and on digital radio. I'm Nana Akweer. And for the next 2 hours, me and my panel will be taking on some of the big topics hitting the headlines right now. This show is all about opinion. It's mine, it's theirs, and of course it's yours. We'll be debating, discussing, and at times we will disagree, but no one will be cancelled. So joining me today is former Liberal Democrat MP Lembit Opik and also Deputy Editor of Spiked Online, Fraser Myers. Before we get started, let's get your latest news headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 4 o'clock. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB newsroom. Pope Francis has offered his condolences to the people of County Donegal after a service station explosion left a tight-knit community in shock. 10 people, including a father and his 5-year-old daughter, were killed and have now all been named by police. A man in his 20s remains in a critical condition in hospital in Dublin. Taoiseach Micheál Martin visited the site of the blast in the small village of Creesla last night. He says the entire nation is in mourning following the tragedy. Irish authorities say the explosion is being treated as a tragic accident, although investigations are ongoing. Russia is assessing the damage on its only bridge to occupied Crimea after a huge blast destroyed large areas of it yesterday. The Kremlin has ordered Russia's Federal Security Service to guard the key route to the occupied peninsula. Traffic has resumed along part of the route.